Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. This is one of the last, maybe even the last, but we'll see, episodes in my now almost year-long series on the English Revolution. And I'm here today with Alison McQueen from the Political Science Department of Stanford University to talk about Thomas Hobbes, one of the, if not maybe the single most important figures in political theory of the past 1,000 years, or Western political theory forever years, but for our purposes is someone who lived through the 1640s in England, and his great timeless work of political philosophy, the Leviathan, was also a very timely response to the politics of his day. So, Alison, thank you for joining me to talk about Hobbes and his times.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, well, can we just get started by talking? Can you tell us a bit about Hobbes's life and where he fits into the political environment of England in the 17th century, and then especially, of course, the monarchy and the revolution?
Of course, Hobbes was born in 1588 to a clerical family, and he was born amidst fears of a coming Spanish armada, which would set sail a month later. And so he writes in one of his autobiographies, "My mother gave birth to twins, myself and fear."
Wow.
And fear is a companion for the rest of Hobbes's life. It's fear of persecution at the hands of the parliamentarian side in the English Revolution that led Hobbes to flee to France in 1640. And as we'll see, fear is also crucial to Hobbes's political philosophy. Now, Hobbes was lucky to get an education, quite a good education, at a grammar school and then at Oxford, funded by his uncle. He wouldn't have gotten there otherwise. His father was not an educated man, nor was he a wealthy one. He was a cleric who got into a bit of local trouble. And so Hobbes is lucky to be sent on to Oxford, and his studies there focused heavily on the scholastic tradition, that combination of philosophy and theology that blended the teachings of Aristotle with those of the early church fathers. And Hobbes found all of this rather useless. He would have preferred an education that focused much more on the natural sciences and mathematics. After Oxford, Hobbes gets a job working for the wealthy Cavendish family, serving as a tutor to William Cavendish, who would later become the second Earl of Devonshire. And he would work for the Cavendish family in one capacity or another for much of his life, and that would prove important. It gave him access to a good library, and it brought him into the orbit of other intellectuals, philosophers, and scientists. Now, the English Revolution, or what Hobbes would have called it, the Civil War, had a profound effect on his philosophy. He fled to Paris before the Civil War started, but he was following developments in England from abroad. So he flees to France in 1640, and he is in Paris surrounded by exiled royalists from England. And he's looking on at this revolution, or in his view, a war that is tearing his country apart. Arguably the bloodiest conflict in British history, staggering death tolls. Anyone would have looked on in horror. But as someone who placed a high value on political order and stability, Hobbes would have been especially disturbed. And in many ways, it's those events in England, in Britain, that are tearing him away from what he'd prefer to be doing, which is his more abstract philosophical work. And they keep bringing him back to political philosophy. So he tells us that he wrote his book De Cive, or On the Citizen, in 1642 as a response to parliamentarian arguments that subjects had a duty to resist their king when his commands were unjust. And he tells us something similar about his great work, Leviathan, that he's there in Paris and people are coming from England and they're saying, Hobbes, the parliamentarians are interpreting these recent royalist defeats as signs of God's support for the parliamentarian side. And Hobbes says, well, I couldn't let that stand. I had to write Leviathan to set us straight on that front. And our best guess is he really gets going on writing Leviathan in the autumn of 1649. And so the recent execution of King Charles I for treason earlier that year would have been looming large over the writing of Leviathan.
All right, that's all very interesting. One of the things that listeners know is I have been playing the game all the way through of matching up things in the English Revolution to the much better known French Revolution. So in what sense is Hobbes's Leviathan fit the role of Burke's reflection on the revolutions in France? Sort of is it the conservative philosophical response to the radicalism seen across the channel? Sorry, I know that's kind of a curveball, but it just sparked in my head.
No, I think it's a legitimate question. And I think one of the things that Hobbes and Burke share is the value they place on political order and stability. That we have a tendency to undervalue political order when we have it, and to fail to recognize how fragile it is. So I think they share that. On the other hand, I'd be cautious about reading Hobbes as a conservative in the way we might read Burke as a conservative. Burke's conservatism, we should take it literally. He prioritizes conserving existing institutions, traditions, and practices. Hobbes on that dimension is much more radical. So let's take one example. The defenders of monarchy and monarchical power in Hobbes's time tended to have recourse to a familiar argument about the divine right of kings. That kings in some way got their powers, their rightful powers from God, and ought not to be checked or questioned by any earthly powers, or certainly not by their subjects. Hobbes rejected the divine right of kings as the basis for legitimate political authority. So in that sense, he was throwing off a heavy weight of tradition in a way I think Burke might have been a bit uncomfortable with. And he throws it off for, as he sees it, good reason. He doesn't think that the divine right of kings is a good basis for political legitimacy. Because the problem is the king only continues to have effective powers so long as his subjects believe that in some way his powers come from God, or that there is this divine connection. And what Hobbes is worried about is as soon as we stop believing that, the legitimacy of the king or the queen disappears from the perspective of the subjects. And that for Hobbes would be a swift road to revolution or civil war. And so I think though he values order, the arguments he has recourse to defend his political philosophy are in many ways much more radical than someone like Burke would be comfortable with.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I'm thinking also, and listeners have heard me say this already. My favorite of the writers from this period, Gerard Winstanley, is profoundly conservative. He claims that there was an order long before the Norman yoke, or even property to begin with. And so what we need for Winstanley is stability, but that stability comes from sort of a community of farmers, diggers as they are called, and clearly perhaps the order in Leviathan comes from fear. Is that fair to say, or at least in part from fear of the dissolution of the order, which is why you have to maintain the current systems of power, because the alternative is, we know what the alternative is. It's anarchy, and that is the worst thing that can happen.
I think that's right. And so we have to attend to Hobbes's terrifying picture of what life looks like in the absence of government, or what he calls in a state of nature. And that is that is an anarchy in the technical sense, and that there is no common political authority, or as Hobbes would put it, no political authority to keep us in awe, in terror and awe. And famously, he thinks that condition, the state of nature, would be terrible. It would be, the one line people might remember from Hobbes is that life without government would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And importantly, it would be a condition of war. Now, that means something very particular for Hobbes. He doesn't mean that we'd be at each other's throats all the time. What he means is that it would be a condition in which the threat of violence is ever present, that there is no assurance against premature, violent, mortal death at the hands of one another. It's a war of every man against every man. And Hobbes wants to offer us a stark choice. It's either that, it's either the state of nature, or it's a virtually absolute state whose sovereign representative has a staggering amount of power and rightful power. And what is striking about Hobbes is he doesn't think that there's any middle ground between those two positions. It is either the war of all against all, or it's the Leviathan state.
All right, I need to step back and let you explain the Leviathan a little bit in a moment, but I can't quite let this go. Again, I'm struck by the sort of bizarro version of Winstanley that we're getting here, or indeed Kropotkin, if you wish, which is Kropotkin and Winstanley would also describe it as the state of nature, but they would say the state of nature is the sort of cooperation of all with all. That's the sort of natural order of things, and it is only this artificial thing called government or hierarchy or whatever you want to call it, the Leviathan, that creates the disorder. In other words, I'm seeing mirror images here. They almost are using the same terms or ways of thinking, and yet exactly opposite. Does that resonate with you?
That does resonate, and fundamentally there is a disagreement in Hobbes's time, and it continues to be a disagreement throughout the Western tradition about this very question of what life would be like in the absence of a common political authority. Now, Hobbes thinks that fundamentally it would be a condition of war in his sense, because he thinks we're all roughly equal, or equal enough in our capacity to kill one another. The strong can overpower the smart can outwit the strong. That we tend to want the same things, food, shelter, some kind of way to cover ourselves and keep warm. Some of those goods are scarce, and that brings us into competition, and that's what leads to war in the end. And given that we know we all want the same things and we're competing for them, we're gonna distrust one another. And he thinks you cannot fundamentally cooperate in those circumstances. And there are a bunch of things to note about this account. In many ways, it's stripped down. The Hobbes scholar Noel Malcolm calls it a de-psychologized account. We don't have to make any robust claims about people's psychology. What's powerful, I think, about the account we get in Leviathan is that it leads to the conclusion of war without having to say anyone is a sadist or in any way terribly motivated. But there's a lot of room for disagreement about this, as you point out. And apart from the folks you mentioned who disagree with Hobbes, including some of the people in his own rough time period, Winstanley, etc. Later on, there's a very powerful critique that comes from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which is, hey, Hobbes, you've made a fundamental error in your reasoning. What you've done is looked out the window in the middle of the 17th century and look at how people are behaving toward one another and said to yourself, oh my gosh, look at how terrible people are even when we have political order. Imagine what these people would be like without political authority. And what Rousseau said is the mistake was that Hobbes was making conclusions on the basis of how people behaved under political authority, making conclusions about what they would be like in the absence of political authority, and that didn't take seriously enough the possibility that it is actually society and institutions that make us bad and antisocial, and that's not how we are naturally. And so I think that is probably the most powerful version of a critique about where Hobbes might have gone wrong in his account of the state of nature. In Hobbes's defense, we might say, even if we don't agree with this picture, that it's perhaps not a surprising one for someone to have come to after seeing his country fall into revolution, or as he would have seen it, civil war. So perhaps his pessimism was sort of indexed to that really extreme set of circumstances in his own time.
Yeah, I was also struck. This is another thing, another connection I'd like to make. So, you use the word terror in terms of what the Leviathan has. It terrifies people so that they stay in line. When we think of terrorism, certainly over the past 50 years or so, it's been linked with attacks on the state, the political order, whatever you want to say. But one of the greatest advocates of terror is Robespierre, and that is state terror, saying the goal of terrorism is to keep people in line. And then you have terrorists who resist the terror of the state with their own terror. And someone like someone like Emma Goldman, a person whose name I forgot briefly, which is very embarrassing on an anarchist podcast, says like, no, you've got the order backwards, precisely as you're saying Rousseau has. The terrorists aren't running around blowing things up because there aren't enough men with guns guarding the streets. The terrorists are merely responding to state terror. And if you want to stop bomb throwing, you should stop military action, and that is the solution. And that sounds to me like a version of what I'm hearing from Rousseau's criticism. The terror begins with the state. It's just that Hobbes thinks that that's a good thing.
I think that's right. I mean, Rousseau might not talk always in terms of terror, but he certainly thinks there are circumstances in which society and state institutions can bring out the worst in us rather than realizing our natural goodness. That's the possibility that he thought Hobbes didn't take seriously enough. Now, for Hobbes's part, though, terror is absolutely crucial to how the state is going to operate. And to see why, again, it helps to return to his picture of what life would be like in the absence of government. Because one might say, especially on an anarchist podcast, why can't you and I just agree in the state of nature to cooperate with one another? Maybe we've found a lovely apple tree and we say, how about we each harvest the apples and we'll share our harvest? We make a verbal agreement. Hobbes thinks that the problem with that in the state of nature is that there is nothing to prevent one or both of us from defecting on that agreement. He tells us that covenants without the sword are but words, just cheap talk. Unless there's a way to enforce an agreement, it's not worth the paper, as it were, that it's written on. And because I know that I have no assurance that you're not going to defect from your agreement, and you have no assurance that I'm not going to defect from my agreement, we're at a bit of an impasse when it comes to cooperation. At the same time, Hobbes thinks we're not dumb. We recognize that actually a world in which it was safe for us to cooperate, in which I could have an assurance that you'd hold up your end of the bargain, and you have an assurance that I could hold up my end of the bargain, is a better world. He just thinks that world only comes with the state. And it comes with a state that is capable of imposing coercive punishments on us. Essentially, what the state is doing for Hobbes is it's raising the cost of you breaking our agreement because the state will come after you if you do, and it's raising the cost of me breaking our agreement. And so now we have much more assurance between one another and we can cooperate on good terms. But the whole thing for Hobbes only works if you've got a state that is capable of passing terrifying punishments, imposing terrifying punishments on us for disobedience. And it's striking how often he talks about that our attitude toward the state should be one of awe, one of terror, one of reverence. And in the famous frontispiece to Leviathan, which gives us a visual representation of the state, there are many things to note about the image, but maybe the most obvious one is this is a giant. It is a monstrous giant looming over the landscape. It ought to be terrifying. At the same time, it's a giant of our making. We make the state. And so it's funny, on the one hand, it seems like this otherworldly, terrifying entity that is coercing us into, for instance, obeying the law and honoring our agreements. But on the other hand, it is the product of human artifice. It is a monster that we have built.
Okay. Yeah, it seems like something that's missing here, and I was trying to get away from this, but I just need to lean into it. If you and I were teaching this to undergraduates, we would be teaching him as someone who does social contract theory. I mean, this is what we are talking about. We are talking about society as a contract, which of course the anarchists have been opposing for as long as there have been anarchists, because they want to say that thinking of all that humans are and can be and all that they mean to each other, this metaphor, the paper it's printed on, I hereby cede to you half of the apples of this apple tree, notarized. Okay, and let's pay the notary as well, and the lawyer and the king. Like they think that's a terrible model for how a society should run. But social contract theory has been for 500, 400, 500 years or so, the model by which Western governments explain what they are doing. And so I'm wondering if you could put Hobbes's, contract theory a bit in context. Why is that metaphor? I mean, I think it's a metaphor. It's not a literal contract. Why is this metaphor the one that Hobbes reaches to and Locke and all the way up to Rawls at least? I assume people are still doing social contract theory, although people seem to just be using Rawls at this stage.
Yes. Well, you're right. An entire venerable tradition of social contract thinking has emerged. We get an early version of a social contract argument in Plato, but you're right. In the modern period, Hobbes is one of the first to offer a fully worked out account of a social contract. Now, it's very interesting that is the device he chooses. And I think he's being extremely canny here. The parliamentarians in the English Revolution had also had recourse to a social contract argument. They said, hey, legitimate government is founded on a contract. The people essentially contract with the king that in exchange for the king providing protection and securing their liberties, that the people owe the king obedience. And they argued that Charles I had broken that contract. Now, Hobbes does something very interesting. He's obviously not a parliamentarian. He is politically their opponent. But what he does is he says, yeah, I'll take your social contract argument, and I'll show you how properly understood it leads to absolutist conclusions. And that is a very Hobbes tactic, to take the argumentative strategies or the images or the rhetorical devices of his opponents and show them how properly understood it leads to his conclusions. And so he uses this device of the social contract to great effect in Leviathan. And he he needs it, because if he's going to reject the divine right of kings as the basis for legitimate rule, he needs some other route to how we could create a legitimate political authority. And so what he's imagining is that we all recognize that the state of nature is terrible. We also all recognize that things would go a lot better, that we'd be able to secure peace if all of us followed certain rules. Rules like honoring our agreements. He calls those rules the laws of nature. The problem is, in the state of nature, it's not safe for us to act on the basis of those rules. You know, you're going to take all the apples, he thinks, and I will starve. And what we realize in thinking it through and maybe talking it through with one another is that the condition that has to be in place for it to be safe for all of us to follow the rules is that we need a state. And in order for that state to be legitimate, he says, because we all begin as free and equal people, legitimate political authority has to arise from some agreement. Now, what he imagines is all of us, and again, I think you're right to cast this as a kind of thought experiment. He imagines all of us agreeing, importantly, with one another to create this entity we call the state, and then to have that state represented by a sovereign. And he says that sovereign could be one man or an assembly of men, but for various reasons, he thinks that it's better to have one. One person can't disagree with themselves. They're going to have a unified will. And so that's his intuition. And he thinks that even though we agree with one another to create that state and then to establish sovereign authority, and that we agree to that out of fear, we agree to it out of fear of one another in the state of nature, that could still be read as a free agreement. Hobbes has a very interesting, we might say implausible, we might say minimal understanding of freedom. To be free is just to be not to be subject to external impediments to motion. And in fact, freedom and fear are consistent for him. So if you approach me in a dark alleyway and hold me up at gunpoint and say, your money or your life, he thinks when I hand over my wallet, that is still a free choice. I could have chosen not to do it. And that's what helps him to this idea that actually we could be seen to freely consent to state authority in a kind of social contract.
Yeah, I think that makes complete sense. This, this accords with Rawls's way of doing it, which is to say that you should be able to you should not pretend that you actually signed that we actually had a meeting where we signed the social contract, but you should be able to imagine what such a meeting would look like. And then you can say, once you've imagined how horrible it would be to not have a social contract, oh, thank goodness. Thank goodness there is a sovereign Leviathan, and I do consent to it freely because I've imagined the alternative.
Yes, that's right. I mean, there's room in the early modern tradition for a fair bit of interpretive debate about how literal any of these contract theorists want to be about the actual contract. You know, Rawls, as in a way the culmination of that tradition, throws his lot entirely into the sort of hypothetical social contract. And people have a bit of debate about how to interpret, say, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. But I think that is a very sensible interpretive view, that this has to be a more of a kind of thought experiment, but also something powerful for individual, as Hobbes would call them, subjects of political authority, which is when you're looking around out at the political conditions around you and you're thinking, oh, do I have to obey this guy? He seems, he calls himself the king, but he seems awfully authoritarian, and I don't know if he's ruling in my interests. Well, this account of the state of nature and the social contract is something all of us can use in our thought process to think about what might have been rational to subject ourselves to this kind of political authority. So I think there is a practical valence to it as well. It's not just a thought experiment for philosophers. It's a thought process that ordinary subjects can go through when they're trying to figure out whether they owe this guy with the crown their obedience.
Okay, I finally finally came up with a way to bring this back to the 1640s, even though I keep bringing up all of it. Like I've plunged us into the 20th and 19th century multiple times. So when social contract theorists sit down to devise system of governments, obviously most famously Madison, they they want a Leviathan, they want a sovereign, but they want a sovereign that is composed of counterbalancing forces because they want to avoid the tyranny of sovereignty, which just seems obviously, of course, in the anarchist tradition, but indeed in the liberal tradition, the greatest fear. Is it because of the Civil War and Parliament's objections to Charles the First that Hobbes doesn't think, oh, and it's good that there's some internal counterbalancing force? You can have a sovereign. James Madison is not arguing that there should not be a sovereign government. He thinks there should be sort of multiple overlapping sovereign governments. Why doesn't Hobbes countenance that? And is it because of the Civil War?
I think your intuition that the Civil War looms large here is a really important one. And I think it can help to think about, well, what are some of the alternatives we might see today to the Leviathan state? I mean, Hobbes's state is virtually absolute. Its authority is unified, it's unlimited, and it's unconditional. That's an extreme vision of state power. And we've talked already about one alternative that Hobbes rules out. Why can't we just have a sort of cooperative anarchy where you and I just agree on the rules and we agree to follow them, conditional on I agree to follow them, conditional on you following them? That's not going to work for Hobbes. It's not worth the paper it's written on, as it were. But let's look at two alternatives that Madison, certainly that the American founders took very seriously. One, as you pointed out, is why not divide political authority? Why not establish different bodies with authority in different spheres? So, for instance, a parliament with authority over revenue, taxation, et cetera, maybe an executive with authority over rule enforcement and foreign relations. Now, to us, that might look, if you share Madison's intuitions, you might think, well, great. It not only has the advantage of maybe giving power to the bodies most suited to exercising it, but also there's this intuition that when we divide power, it limits power by checking it. Hobbes anticipates this possibility and says the problem with that is what happens when conflicts emerge between the branches. That wasn't just a theoretical possibility. That was, to get back to your point, one way of reading what happened in the English Revolution. It emerged from this conflict between Parliament on the one hand and the king on the other. Now, the other option that, and Hobbes thinks, conflicts between branches, swift road to civil war. Another option that is also built in to the American system and would be built in to the English system later in the 17th century is limited authority. I'm drawing on a former colleague here, Joshua Cohen, who sketches out these alternatives nicely. So limited authority, why not just agree on a set of rules and principles? And then we say, okay, we've got the rules and principles. Let's establish a political authority. And we're obligated to obey it, conditional on it remaining within the bounds set by those rules. And so that, the American system has something of that with the Constitution as a kind of limit on political authority. England would develop it with Britain with constitutional monarchy. And Hobbes's question is, well, what do we do when people disagree over the question of whether the sovereign has overstepped the limits of his or her authority? At the extreme, he says, the controversy returns to the sword again. We're back to civil war. And so I think your intuition there that the civil war looms large and really leads Hobbes to reject some of what we might now see as the alternatives to absolute political authority. That's a very good intuition. Another way to put it, though, to locate Hobbes within his time is not just to think about the Civil War, but to think about what other viable political alternatives he saw around him in Europe. And so the great Italian republics of the Renaissance, which did have forms of divided authority, by Hobbes's time had mostly fallen, and some of them being ruled pretty monarchically. And in terms of limited authority, we hadn't yet had the glorious revolution, which led to Britain's great experiment with constitutional monarchy. And of course, the United States, as we came to know it, did not yet exist. And so what looks clearer to us today, that forms of divided or limited political authority can, in fact, be stable over time and not degenerate into civil war. Those examples didn't yet exist for Hobbes. And I think it's important to remember that. So it's the combination of those two things, the recent experience of civil war and the fact that he had the examples of viable, stable political authority looked very different in his time than they do in ours.
Yeah, I mean, obviously those governments hadn't been established, but Lilburn is right there at advocating for something that looks exactly like what you're describing. So I guess maybe you've answered the question, but just to push it further, what is it about Hobbes's ideas or temperament or fear would lead him to look at Lilburn? I mean, I'm not talking about Winstanley,
Yeah.
but Lilburn, and say, no, this is too scary.
Well, I think you've put your finger on it, which is just to say that Hobbes is perhaps a little more risk averse. That the questions of political order are perhaps not questions where we want to be conducting radical experiments. That those experiments have costs and, at their extreme, lead us back to civil war. Now, what you could say on the other side against Hobbes is virtually absolute state authority also has costs. And that perhaps Hobbes is being too risk averse about the threat of civil war and too risk acceptant about the threats to our lives, our property, our well-being that come from concentrating power so firmly in the hands of a single person. John Locke put the worry really well about a generation later. And his way of putting it, essentially, to put it in contemporary language, is to say that the mistake Hobbes made was that he proposed a solution that was worse than the problem it was meant to solve. And so, from the fact that we might fear one another in a state of nature, it doesn't follow that it's rational to give almost all the rights and all the guns and all the lawmaking power to one guy or woman, Hobbes was open to that, who, if they weren't already kind of antisocial and power hungry to begin with, would become so by virtue of that power, would be made, as Locke would put it, licentious with impunity. And I think that's a really good criticism of Hobbes, that in a way, really, he's really too risk averse when it comes to experiments with something other than virtually absolute sovereign power, and yet strangely risk acceptant when it comes to the predictable risks of concentrating power in one person or one assembly.
So Burke solves this problem by saying, Lilburn's vision can be realized, that's fine, but let's do it as slowly as possible within this sort of natural, organic change over time. It seems to me that Hobbes has a more like Platonic or Aristotelian, like things are going to degenerate into you can call it anarchy or whatever you want to, and then be reconstituted as a monarchy. And there's not going to be. I don't see a theory of, or rather, Plato's theory of change is a cyclical one. When the Leviathan breaks down, I mean, no, Plato didn't call it the Leviathan, but when the sovereign state breaks down, it is to fall apart and be reconstituted as the sovereign state again over and over. Burke seems to me to say, like, we can have a whole new system of government as long as we're very careful to let it grow over time and we maintain the foundations. Is there any sense that slow, gradual change is possible in Hobbes?
This is interesting. I think that there's some sense in which what Hobbes is offering us in Leviathan is a very idealized or utopian account. There, the comparison to Plato is perhaps quite sensible. And at the same time, though, Hobbes does realize that worldly politics is going to change in ways that don't necessarily conform to his theory. Now, he doesn't have an account that's quite equivalent to Burke of a sort of advocacy of slow change, of reform over revolution. Again, that's tied up with Burke's very particular kind of conservatism and also his admiration for how the English common law tradition accommodates that kind of piecemeal change. At the same time, Hobbes is very interesting in how he does adapt to changes that are actually going on the ground. And so while as a person, he was a royalist, and in fact his vision of absolute sovereignty kind of put, and the virtually absolute powers of the king put him kind of on the far end of royalism. At the same time, when Leviathan is published in 1651, Charles I has been executed, and the country's now being run by Oliver Cromwell. And it's very interesting that despite Hobbes's preference for monarchy, despite his firm arguments that the parliamentarian side had behaved unjustly in the Civil War, they had challenged the rightful powers of the kings, they'd done something very wrong, that now that they had established effective government and Cromwell was doing his sovereignty things of offering protection, that he was owed obedience. And so I think that even though Hobbes doesn't have quite like a Burkean theory of change, his theory can accommodate on the ground change in an interesting way. That he says in the review and conclusion of Leviathan that essentially, if you're thinking about who to obey, you owe obedience to whoever is protecting you. And at that point, it was Cromwell backed by the parliamentarians. So I think that is something that's interesting about Hobbes, and it also explains why, in the end, Leviathan really made nobody happy. The royalists weren't happy about it because it seemed to be asking people to accommodate themselves to Cromwell, and also because it rejected divine right and it offered this social contract argument. And of course, the parliamentarians weren't happy with it because of its absolutism. But I think it does reveal something important about Hobbes, which is that the theory itself can accommodate pretty radical regime change.
Yeah, that's perfect. I know you had told me that someone described it as a rebel's catechism, and that makes sense to me. I mean, one of the things, as someone who does not have a monarchical turn of mind at all myself, I find the concept of usurpers very, very confusing. Like everyone is a usurper at some point, or his grandfather, or whatever. Usurper just means people are loyal to the old monarch. It's really a statement about someone's frame of mind. It's not a statement about legitimacy, at least in my reading. And it sounds like that's Hobbes's reading as well. It doesn't matter if your dad was king. What matters is if you're in the center of power holding the body politic together.
That's right. He wants to separate the question of the justice of how someone came to have power from whether once they do, you have to obey them. And that's what allows him to say the parliamentarian side did not behave justly in, rebelling against and subsequently executing the, as Hobbes would have seen it, rightful King of England. Once they're in power, though, if they're successfully wielding power, we ought to obey them. And again, yes, that really disrupts a lot of old intuitions about rightfulness of rule coming from some hereditary claim. And I think that is part of what is radical about Hobbes. And it's part of what made some of his readers very uncomfortable. And so you're right, it was John Bramall, Bishop Bramall, an Anglican theologian, one of Hobbes's most dogged sparring partners, who called Leviathan a rebel's catechism. And he had earlier said the same thing about a previous work of Hobbes's, De Cive, or On the Citizen. And it's in part for that sort of flexibility in Hobbes, that you owe obedience to whoever is protecting you, is rejection of divine right. It's in part that he rests the argument for legitimate government on a social contract. And to Bramhall, that was awfully uncomfortable. As soon as you start to get in the language of contract, it seems to open up the door to resistance. But it's also that Hobbes did explicitly make space, a tiny space, but an important one, for individual resistance. And the thought went something like this: the one right we can never transfer to anyone else, that we can never give up, is our individual right to self-preservation. And that leads to these important conflicts of rights in Hobbes's theory. So if your sovereign has condemned you to death, that's certainly within their power to do. They have the right. But because you never gave up your right to self-preservation, you also have the right to resist that death. And as the great intellectual historian Quentin Skinner says, this gives rise to the strange image that a subject could be up there on the execution block, having been rightfully condemned to death, but also having the right to try and wrestle the axe out of the executioner's hands. And for that reason as well, critics like Bramall looked at Leviathan and said, it leaves too much space for rebellion. It's a rebel's catechism.
Yeah, this is the smallest number of checks and balances one can imagine. There's one. There's literally one check, but it's there. So as we're approaching the end, I want to say, speaking of Quentin Skinner, I kind of did this exactly how I said I didn't want to do it, in that I asked you questions about Burke, and we talked about Rousseau, and I brought up John Rawls and Plato, and I exactly put, to use a metaphor I like, and I used in my conversation about Milton, like these mountains. Nietzsche says one way to read history is a bunch of mountains, and then we forget all of the valleys. So is there anything to leave the mountains aside and go back to this richer landscape of the 1640s and 1650s? Is there anything else we really need to know about Hobbes in his time that will help us understand the Leviathan, which I am at least so used to talking about in relation to Locke and Madison and Plato and Kant, who I didn't mention, but I should not have brought another a historical name in there. Is there anything else we need to know about him in this moment, so when we read this text, we're grasping it precisely in this Quentin Skinner way, as opposed to in this ahistorical way?
Good. Yes, it's really easy, especially when we teach courses or for students take courses that give a canon, to have the false perception that all these greats are responding to one another. And there are times when they are, but really each of them are also responding to sort of the facts on the ground in their own time. And so, yes, we did talk a little bit about how Hobbes is sort of looking at the argumentative tactics of parliamentarians, including people we might not read today on a political theory syllabus, because most of their writings were sort of more occasional targeted interventions into the debates of their day. Hobbes is really looking at those arguments. That's part of the power of him taking up this social contract device, as he sees that device working in the everyday political speeches and writings of parliamentarians. And that is something that Quentin Skinner's work really draws up, how much Hobbes, despite having written this very seemingly abstract, it can look very armchair kind of work of political philosophy, is actually deeply involved in the politics of his time. The other thing I think I'd mention that's very important for Hobbes in his context is just how much religious disagreement there was at the time too, which fed into the English Revolution. And so you've got on the one hand the people we tend to call a bit imprecisely Puritans, who don't think the Reformation went far enough, like let's continue that good work of Reformation. And then you've got, on the other hand, you've got Charles I, who espouses a sort of brand of Protestantism that brings him as close as possible to Catholicism. And unfortunately for him, too, was also married to a Catholic. And so you've got these people looking on at that saying, oh, I thought we threw off the weight of Catholicism, and here it's coming back in. And so a lot of the conflict of the revolution is layered with these religious disagreements. And Hobbes is very attentive to those as well. And I think that explains why the entire second half of Leviathan, which is the half we don't tend to read anymore in courses, is that so much of this fight is taking place on the battleground of religion. And Hobbes realizes he's going to have to say something to these believers. He's going to have to argue in terms they can accept, that peace requires them to be obedient as well.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I just want to stress for listeners that how can I put this? And I'm thinking of Quentin Skinner, and I'm thinking of Wittgenstein, but I'm always thinking of Wittgenstein, of the sense of like, when you hear the word religion, the way we use it in 2024, you're thinking like, oh, thank goodness that we've gotten religion out of politics, or something like that. Oh, why are they mixing religion and politics? That is just a fundamental error to say, oh, is this a political or a religious concept? When we're thinking about the 1640s, the political was the religious, and vice versa. And I don't say that in a pejorative sense. And for Lilburn and Winstanley and Milton and Ebenezer Cupp, the religious and the political were intertwined in a way that I think is just difficult for us to grasp.
I think that's right. The conception of religion as this thing that is separate from politics, as a thing that is interior to the individual and their belief, and has not much to do with how they conduct themselves in public, is a conception of religion that gets crafted over time. It's not one that, if people are beginning to start to think in those terms, Hobbes is one of those people, but the masses certainly haven't got the message yet. Yeah. And it's a conception that has to be developed. It has to be made. It has to be defended over time. That said, I think one of the things that's most remarkable about Hobbes is there are ways in which he is starting to craft that much more familiar contemporary conception of religion. He has a naturalistic account of religion, that it emerges from our fear and anxiety about the times to come, our worry about our curiosity about first causes leads us to kind of posit this great power that we call God. And he's also one of the first to take a move in the direction of what we now call critical biblical scholarship in questioning the authorship of the Pentateuch and getting us to try and take seriously that these scriptural books were written by people. And so he is this interesting bridge figure. He is anticipating a much more modern view of religion, but that's a vision that would have been very uncomfortable and strange and alien to people in his time. And I think in part he realizes that, and that's why the second half of Leviathan really is trying to meet believers on the terms of Scripture and to start with where they're at and try and reason from there.
All right, that's wonderful. That's perfect. It connects Hobbes to the Enlightenment and takes us, where we need to go in history. All that's left to say, Alison, is there anything else that we didn't say, that any question I didn't ask, or just anything else you would like to share before we go?
No, I think this has been a good conversation, and what I would urge on everyone is that Hobbes rewards close reading, even for those who disagree fundamentally with his conclusions, because he makes us question all of the things that we might just accept as matters of belief, maybe that humans are cooperative, that we can live peacefully together, that maybe our priority ought not to be order, but instead ought to be justice. Reading Hobbes is going to make all of us be able to think about, to question those commitments, and hopefully, if we still believe them, to defend them more forcefully.
That's so interesting, because I take the value of reading Hobbes to be the exact opposite. I feel like, and this is something listeners have heard many times, and maybe they're sick of it, and maybe this is the wrong thing to say, but I feel like when I speak to whatever you want to call them, American progressives, there is a sort of reflexive Hobbesianism. Oh, why do we have these state governments? We got to get rid of them. Oh, I'm so tired of hearing about what Texas is doing. I just wish that Obama would sweep aside all of this stuff and give everyone universal health care. And I am all for universal health care. But I see an anti-democratic Hobbesian ethos taking over a, whatever you want to call it, progressive elite class. Because unlike Hobbes, they are not willing to meet their political opponents where they are and understand why might they have a different sense of what the government should be doing. I see a Hobbesian frustration with these stupid, unwashed masses when I read the New York Times. Maybe that is unfair to those people, but that's what I'm seeing. So I read Hobbes to say, look, people, this is what you're saying. You are on the same side as Hobbes when you are calling for an end to American checks and balances and the imposition of the progressive elite's view of the good, a view of the good that I will admit that I share, except for the elite imposition of it on people to whom it is alien.
Well, I'll give you another example, which is that another place where we see the pull of a kind of Hobbesian vision of political authority is in certain sectors of the environmental movement that worry that a modern liberal democratic states just cannot move in the decisive and fast ways that we need to deal with the problem of climate change. So there's another area where people sort of who find themselves on the more progressive end of politics might feel the pull of a Hobbes style of argument. And then what I'd say, the case I'd make then for the people we're talking about, why they should read Leviathan, is, well, see what you might be committing yourself to. And give that a bit of a think.
I have to break in, Alison, because the political scientist, blogger for Crooked Timber, Henry Farrell, was on the podcast recently, and he said that, he described me as, an anarchist where he was merely a wishy-washy democratic socialist. But then he said, I wish we had a climate Leviathan, and if I don't want him to be to get allow I didn't want to allow him to describe himself as wishy-washy, and also want a Leviathan. If you're going to commit to a Leviathan, you need to commit to it. I think, and it's a vision that is appealing to a number of people, and I mean, what do I know? Might even be right, but I agree with you that it entails a a commitment to something that I think people would be wise to read him carefully before they commit that. That is excellent advice.
I think the final thing to say about that is to remember the very powerful criticism that Locke will make a generation later about Hobbes, that Hobbes may be a bit pessimistic about human nature, but he's perhaps overly optimistic about the nature and behavior of the person who's going to occupy the role of the sovereign. And so for perhaps Democrats in the United States, they'd be very happy with a Leviathan sovereign if that Leviathan had been, let's say, Obama.
Yes.
But what you have to remember is it might be Obama today, and it might be someone very different the next day. And I think that that's part of what you have to commit yourself to if you want a Leviathan. It's not always going to be the person you would choose for that role.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. That's excellent advice. And this has been just a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, Alison.
Thank you so much.